I walked into Morton's Steakhouse 20 minutes late, scanning the crowded restaurant until I spotted my family's table near the back. Jake was already holding court, gesturing wildly with his beer bottle, while our parents hung on his every word. The moment my mom saw me approaching, her face twisted into that familiar expression of disappointment I'd known since childhood. "Leave," she said loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Covering bills doesn't mean you matter here." Dad immediately jumped in his voice, carrying that condescending tone he reserved especially for me. "You're just bitter. He's doing better than you." I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and showed them the screen displaying $7,300 in monthly automatic transfers. Looking directly at Jake's shocked face, I said calmly, "Great. Then he can handle this from now on." 3 years earlier, everything had been different. My freelance marketing consultancy had just landed its biggest client, a regional restaurant chain that needed a complete digital overhaul. The contract was worth more money than I'd ever seen in one place. And for the first time since college, I felt like I was building something real. That was right around the time Dad's construction business started falling apart. The back injury happened on a Tuesday morning in March. Dad was helping frame a house when a support beam shifted, catching him across the lower spine. What started as a workers' compensation claim turned into months of medical appointments, physical therapy sessions that insurance wouldn't fully cover, and a growing stack of bills that multiplied faster than Dad could count them. The construction company he'd worked for 23 years suddenly found reasons to challenge his claim, leaving him caught between lawyers and doctors while his savings disappeared. Mom's part-time job at Nordstrom Rack barely covered groceries, even with her employee discount. She'd always been proud of their middle-class life, the 4-bedroom house in suburbia, the annual family vacations to Lake Tahoe. Watching it all slip away left her bitter and desperate, constantly calculating which bills could wait another month without destroying their credit completely. Jake was 26 then, working as an entry-level car salesman at a Chevy dealership in Riverside. He had the charm for sales, but not the discipline. His rent was consistently late, his credit cards maxed out from trying to maintain the lifestyle he thought he deserved. When his apartment complex started eviction proceedings, he came to family dinner with tears in his eyes, begging for help like he was still the little brother who'd cried over scraped knees. Emma was the only one whose situation made complete sense to me. College tuition had skyrocketed since I'd graduated, and nursing programs were notoriously expensive. She was a junior at UC San Diego, working 20 hours a week at a campus coffee shop while maintaining a 3.8 GPA. When the financial aid office called to say her student loans wouldn't cover spring semester, I knew exactly what I had to do. I started small, telling myself it would be temporary. $500 here for Dad's physical therapy copays, $300 there for Mom's prescription medications. Jake's rent was $1,200 a month, which seemed reasonable for helping family avoid homelessness. Emma's tuition payment of $2,100 was an investment in her future, something that would pay dividends for decades. But temporary became permanent, and reasonable became expected. Dad's mortgage was $1,800 monthly. Mom's credit card minimums added up to $950. The family health insurance plan that covered everyone cost $1,250 per month. Before I realized what had happened, I was automatically transferring $7,300 every month to various family members, watching my own bank account drain while they slowly rebuilt their lives. I sold my downtown condo and moved into a studio apartment in a complex that smelled like cooking oil and cigarettes. My BMW lease expired, replaced by a 10-year-old Honda Civic that had seen better decades. Dinners out became ramen noodles at home, The gym membership, streaming services, and weekend trips all disappeared from my budget. The worst part was how naturally everyone accepted it. Nobody asked how I managed to cover everything. Nobody wondered why I'd moved to a smaller place or drove an older car. They just expected the money to appear each month like it was coming from some infinite source that required no sacrifice on anyone's part. Jake started telling people at the dealership that his family had money, that he came from the kind of background where financial support was just normal. He'd complain about me to his coworkers, painting me as the jealous older brother who resented his natural charisma and sales ability. According to Jake's version of reality, I was bitter about his success while contributing nothing meaningful to the family myself. Morton's was Jake's choice for celebrating his promotion to regional sales manager. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd picked one of the most expensive restaurants in town while I was paying his rent every month. I'd worked late trying to finish a client presentation, which explained my 20-minute delay, but nobody bothered asking why I was running behind. Uncle Pete and Aunt Sarah were there along with their twin sons, who were home from college for spring break. Jake's girlfriend Brittany sat beside him wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She kept taking photos of the table, the wine glasses, Jake's proud expression, creating a social media narrative of success that had nothing to do with reality. Jake stood up when I arrived, clearly already several drinks into the celebration. His face was flushed with alcohol and excitement as he launched into the story of his promotion for what was probably the fourth time that evening. Regional sales manager meant overseeing 6 dealerships across Southern California, a salary bump to $85,000 per year, plus commission bonuses that could add another $20,000 annually. Mom raised her wine glass, her voice carrying across the restaurant as she delivered what sounded like a prepared speech. She talked about Jake's independence, his determination to succeed without needing handouts from anyone. She praised his work ethic, his natural leadership abilities, his refusal to rely on family money like some people did. The way she emphasized some people while looking directly at me made it clear who she meant. Dad joined in enthusiastically, nodding along as he talked about Jake's real success, the kind that came from actual achievement rather than jealousy and resentment. He mentioned how proud he was to have a son who'd built something meaningful with his life, who didn't waste time being bitter about other people doing better than him. Uncle Pete shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing the family dynamics at play. Aunt Sarah kept glancing between me and my parents, her expression suggesting she suspected there was more to the story than what was being said. The twins looked confused by the obvious tension, too young to understand the complicated relationships that had developed over years of financial dependence disguised as family support. Brittany was recording Jake's response speech on her phone, capturing what she thought was a heartwarming family moment. Jake thanked everyone for their support, specifically mentioning how he'd succeeded, despite not having the advantages some people expected. He talked about building his career from the ground up, proving himself through hard work, rather than relying on handouts or family connections. The restaurant was buzzing with other families celebrating their own milestones. Couples on date nights, business dinners where people discussed deals and partnerships. Our table felt like an island of dysfunction in the middle of all that normalcy, with everyone pretending not to notice the obvious undercurrents of resentment and manipulation. I listened to speech after speech about Jake's independence and success, watching my parents celebrate the son who'd never needed anything from them, while treating me like a failure who couldn't measure up. The math was simple enough. I'd transferred over $200,000 to this family in 3 years, watching them rebuild their lives while mine got smaller and more constrained every month. When I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app, I could see the automatic transfers scheduled for the next day. $1,800 for Dad's mortgage, $950 for Mom's credit cards, $1,200 for Jake's rent, $2,100 for Emma's tuition, $1,250 for the family health insurance that covered everyone except me, since I'd switched to a catastrophic plan to save money. Jake didn't deny anything when I showed them the screen. Instead, he doubled down his voice, getting louder as the alcohol and adrenaline kicked in. He said I owed the family for investing in my potential during childhood, for giving me the foundation that allowed me to build a business in the first place. According to Jake, my financial support wasn't generosity. It was paying back what I'd already received. The other diners were starting to stare as our table got louder and more heated. Brittany looked mortified as she realized the man she'd been dating lived off his brother's monthly payments. Uncle Pete was trying to signal to Dad that this wasn't the time or place for family drama. The twins had stopped eating, watching the adults destroy what was supposed to be a celebration. I left the restaurant without saying another word, walking past the hostess station while my family continued arguing behind me. The valet brought my Honda Civic around, and I could see through the restaurant windows that Jake was gesturing wildly, probably explaining to everyone why I was wrong to expect gratitude for doing what family members were supposed to do for each other. The drive home took 40 minutes through late evening traffic, giving me plenty of time to process what had just happened. 3 years of sacrifice of rebuilding their lives, while mine got smaller and more constrained, and they had turned me into the villain in their story. I wasn't the brother who'd prevented foreclosure on their house or kept Jake from being evicted. I was the bitter failure who resented their success. My studio apartment felt smaller than usual when I walked through the door. The furniture was mismatched, bought from thrift stores and Facebook Marketplace over the past few years. My laptop sat on a folding table that doubled as my dining room and home office. The efficiency kitchen barely had space for one person to cook. Not that I did much cooking beyond heating up frozen dinners and making coffee. I opened the laptop and logged into my bank's website, staring at the automatic transfer screen that had governed my life for 3 years. 18 payments scheduled for the next morning. Everything from Dad's mortgage to Mom's cell phone plan to Jake's car insurance. $7,850, not $7,300, like I'd said at dinner. I'd actually understated how much they were taking from me every month. Canceling the transfers took less than 10 minutes. Click, confirm, done. Each cancellation generated an email confirmation that I saved in a folder labeled Family Financial Independence. The health insurance required a phone call to the customer service line where a helpful representative expressed surprise that I was removing 4 people from my plan all at once. Is this because of a change in employment status? She asked, probably reading from a script about life events that typically triggered insurance changes. No, I told her. It's because of a change in family status. My phone started ringing at 2 a.m. Mom first crying about how I couldn't just abandon them without warning. Then Dad angry and demanding that I explain myself like he was still disciplining a teenager. Jake called 6 times in a row, each voicemail, getting more desperate as he realized his rent was due in 3 days, and his bank account couldn't cover it. I turned the phone to silent and went to sleep. Emma called the next morning while I was drinking coffee and checking email. Her meal plan had been declined when she tried to get breakfast at the campus dining hall, and the financial aid office was asking about her tuition payment for the summer session. Her voice was confused rather than angry. She genuinely didn't understand what was happening or why the money had suddenly stopped. Adam, did something happen with your bank account? She asked. The school says my tuition payment was rejected. I explained the situation from the beginning, starting with the promotion dinner, and ending with my decision to stop enabling everyone's dependence on my income. Emma listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or understanding as the full picture became clear. "I had no idea it was that much money," she said when I finished. "I thought you were just helping with tuition, not paying for everything." My neighbor Marcus knocked on the door around 10, holding a cup of coffee, and wearing the concerned expression of someone who'd heard raised voices the night before. Marcus was a retired teacher, the kind of neighbor who noticed when people seemed upset and actually cared enough to check on them. "Rough night?" he asked, settling into the one decent chair in my living space. I told him about the dinner, the payments, the years of feeling like an ATM machine with legs. Marcus listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or shaking his head as the story unfolded. "My ex-wife did something similar," he said when I finished. "Not with money, but with emotional support. I spent 15 years thinking I was helping her become more independent, when really I was just enabling her to stay dependent. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop helping." Carlos called during lunch, my best friend since college who'd watched this whole situation develop over 3 years. He'd been telling me to set boundaries with my family since the financial support started. But I'd always found excuses for why this month was different, why they needed just a little more time to get back on their feet. "About time," he said when I explained what had happened. "I was starting to think you enjoyed being their personal bank. I thought I was helping them become independent. Adam, you were paying their bills. That's the opposite of independence." The text messages from Jake started around noon when he'd sobered up enough to realize the implications of what had happened. His rent was due Friday, and his bank account had enough money for groceries, but not enough to cover $1,200. His credit cards were maxed out from living above his means, assuming my monthly payments would continue forever. But the message that really shocked me came through my business email, forwarded by a client I'd worked with for 2 years. Jake had contacted Riverside Marketing Solutions, asking if they needed real marketing help from someone with actual business experience. He'd sent them his resume highlighting his new promotion and suggesting that my services were overpriced compared to what he could offer. My brother was actively trying to steal my clients while I was paying his rent. The next 3 days unfolded like a masterclass in family dysfunction. Each phase of their response was more desperate than the last, starting with denial and escalating to manipulation tactics I hadn't seen since I was a teenager, trying to establish independence for the first time. Day 1 was all about misunderstandings. Mom called every 2 hours, leaving voicemails explaining that she hadn't meant what she'd said at dinner, that emotions had been running high because of Jake's big news. She suggested we all sit down together and work out our differences, like adults, completely ignoring the fact that the differences involved me subsidizing their entire lifestyle, while they treated me like a second-class family member. Dad's approach was more direct. He showed up at my apartment building at 7 in the morning, pressing the buzzer until other residents started complaining about the noise. When I didn't answer, he called the building manager, claiming there was a family emergency that required immediate access to my unit. The manager, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who'd dealt with her share of family drama, told him to contact the police if it was a real emergency, or leave the property if it wasn't. Jake tried a different strategy, reaching out to mutual friends and asking them to intervene on his behalf. He told everyone who would listen that I'd had some kind of mental breakdown, that stress from work had made me paranoid about family relationships. According to Jake's version, I'd misinterpreted innocent comments at dinner and overreacted by cutting off financial support that wasn't even that significant. Day 2 brought the anger phase when denial stopped working, and reality started sinking in. Dad's second visit to my building involved him shouting through the intercom about ungrateful children and family obligations. He'd grown up in a generation where family members sacrificed for each other without expecting recognition. And my behavior represented everything wrong with modern selfishness. Security called the police after residents complained about the disturbance. 2 officers arrived to find Dad sitting in the lobby muttering about disrespectful children, while building management waited for him to leave voluntarily. The officers were polite but firm. He could either leave peacefully or be escorted out with trespassing charges. Mom's anger manifested differently. She drove to my office building downtown, creating a scene in the lobby that involved tears, raised voices, and security guards who weren't trained to handle family emotional meltdowns. She demanded to speak with my boss, claiming I was having personal problems that were affecting my work performance. The building management eventually called me upstairs to collect her before they called the police. "You're destroying this family," she said as I walked her to her car. "Everything we built, everything we worked for, you're tearing it apart because you can't handle Jake being more successful than you." The real consequences were starting to show by day 3. First, National Bank sent an automated courtesy notice about Dad's missed mortgage payment, the kind of gentle reminder that preceded serious collection efforts. Mom's credit card companies started calling about minimum payments that hadn't been processed, threatening late fees and interest rate increases that would make their financial situation even worse. Jake's landlord posted a 3-day notice on his apartment door, beginning the formal eviction process that would destroy his credit and make finding another rental nearly impossible. His car payment was also late, prompting calls from the dealership's financing department about potential repossession. That's when the bargaining phase began. Mom suggested we split the difference, offering to find ways for Jake to contribute something toward the family expenses if I would resume partial payments. She'd clearly spent time calculating which bills were most critical, preparing to negotiate like this was a business transaction rather than a family relationship. Jake's approach was more sophisticated. He'd researched emotional manipulation tactics online using phrases like family healing and mutual understanding, while suggesting we attend therapy together to work through our communication issues. He even offered to pay me back someday, though he was vague about timeline and amounts. Uncle Pete called to lecture me about family loyalty, explaining that previous generations had understood obligations that modern people couldn't appreciate. According to him, my grandparents had sacrificed for their children without expecting gratitude, and my behavior represented a selfishness that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. Aunt Sarah took a different approach, calling to share her own financial struggles, and suggesting that family members needed to support each other during difficult times. She mentioned her own mortgage problems, medical bills from her husband's heart surgery, and college expenses for the twins. The subtext was clear. Everyone had problems, and mine weren't special enough to justify abandoning family responsibilities. The harassment wasn't limited to family members. Jake had been reaching out to my professional network, contacting people who'd worked with me, and suggesting they might need more reliable marketing services. He'd created a narrative about my mental instability using the family financial situation as evidence that I made poor decisions and couldn't be trusted with important business relationships. Carlos offered to put me in touch with his attorney friend who specialized in harassment cases. Marcus mentioned that his tenants' rights organization had resources for people dealing with family stalking. My therapist, Dr. Rodriguez, suggested emergency sessions to help me process the escalating situation without getting pulled back into old patterns of guilt and obligation. The most shocking development came on day 3 when I received a call from Jake's employer. Human Resources had questions about the business partnership Jake had mentioned in his promotion application, specifically about the testimonials and financial references he'd provided. According to their records, Jake had listed me as his business partner and had used client testimonials from my marketing work as evidence of his own professional achievements. Mr. Stewart, the HR representative, said, "We need to verify the nature of your business relationship with Jake Stewart. His application materials suggest you're partners in a marketing consulting firm, but our preliminary research indicates you operate independently. Jake had committed employment fraud using my professional reputation and client relationships to secure his promotion. The financial support I'd provided to help him succeed had been reframed as evidence of our business partnership with my success, becoming proof of his capabilities." Emma arrived on a Thursday morning, having driven straight from San Diego after her Tuesday night phone call with Mom. She looked exhausted from the 4-hour drive and emotionally drained from dealing with family pressure that she was too young and financially dependent to resist effectively. "They want me to convince you to change your mind," she said, settling into my living space with a duffel bag and the kind of serious expression that made her look older than 23. "Mom gave me a whole speech about family loyalty and how you're having some kind of breakdown." I made coffee while Emma looked around the studio apartment, her eyes taking in the folding table that served as my desk, the air mattress that had replaced my real bed after I sold it to help cover one of Dad's medical emergencies, the refrigerator that was mostly empty because I'd been living on ramen and peanut butter sandwiches to maximize the money available for family support. "Adam, this place is tiny," she said, sitting on the one decent piece of furniture I owned, a reading chair I'd bought from a yard sale. "Where do you sleep?" I showed her the air mattress in the corner, explaining that the real bed had been sold along with most of my furniture when I'd downsized to make room in my budget for their expenses. Emma's expression shifted from confusion to horror as she began to understand the scope of what I'd sacrificed over 3 years. "You sold your bed to help pay our bills." "I sold a lot of things." We spent the next 2 days going through my bank statements together with Emma, asking questions about specific payments and learning details about the family's financial situation that she'd never understood. Her tuition payments were just part of a much larger picture that included everyone's basic living expenses, insurance premiums, medical co-pays, and dozens of smaller monthly obligations that added up to nearly $8,000. "I thought you were just helping with school," she said, staring at the laptop screen showing 3 years of automatic transfers. "I had no idea you were paying for everything." Emma was particularly shocked by Jake's living situation. His rent alone was more than her entire monthly budget, including food textbooks and entertainment. While she was working 20 hours a week and living in a shared dorm room, he'd been enjoying a 1-bedroom apartment in a luxury complex with amenities he couldn't afford even with his promotion. "He complains about money all the time," she said. "I always assumed he was struggling like the rest of us." On Friday evening, Emma drove back to confront our parents directly. She spent the weekend at their house listening to their version of recent events and asking questions they weren't prepared to answer. When she returned Sunday night, her perspective had shifted completely. "They're planning something," she warned me. "They had a family meeting without you, and Jake was doing most of the talking. He's convinced them that you're having some kind of mental health crisis, and that they need to intervene before you destroy your own life." The family's united front strategy became clear over the next few days. They'd decided to present my behavior as evidence of psychological instability, rather than a reasonable response to years of financial manipulation. According to their narrative, successful people didn't live in studio apartments or drive old cars, which meant my living situation was proof that I wasn't thinking clearly. Jake had researched involuntary psychiatric holds, suggesting to Dad that my behavior met criteria for someone who might be a danger to himself or others. He'd found online resources about adult children who developed paranoid delusions about family relationships using my legitimate grievances as evidence of delusional thinking. Mom's role was to document my erratic behavior by keeping a journal of our phone conversations and interactions. She'd started recording our calls without my knowledge, planning to use them as evidence that I was emotionally unstable and needed professional intervention against my will. The pressure on Emma was intense. She was financially dependent on the family for school expenses that I was no longer covering, which gave them enormous leverage over her decisions. They demanded that she choose sides, either support their intervention plan or lose her tuition support and housing money. They want me to testify that you've been acting strange, Emma told me Tuesday evening. They're talking about getting a court order for a psychiatric evaluation. The external pressures were escalating rapidly. Neighbors had called police twice about screaming arguments at my parents' house with Dad, and Jake having heated confrontations about whose fault the financial crisis really was. Jake's relationship with Brittany had ended after she learned about his employment fraud and his dependence on family money he'd claimed came from his own success. Bank representatives had started calling about the foreclosure process, which would begin in earnest if Dad missed another mortgage payment. Jake's apartment complex had moved forward with eviction proceedings, giving him 10 days to vacate or face legal action that would follow him for years. The community response was mixed. Church members who'd known our family for decades were confused by conflicting versions of what was happening. Uncle Pete and Aunt Sarah were getting pressure from both sides to mediate, with each family member presenting dramatically different accounts of the situation. Some extended family members were taking sides based on their own financial situations and perspectives on family obligations. Cousin David, who'd supported his own parents through medical emergencies, thought I was being selfish. Cousin Lisa, who'd cut off her own financially abusive siblings, offered her complete support for my decision. Jake's professional situation was deteriorating rapidly. The HR investigation at his dealership had expanded beyond his promotion application to include questions about his overall truthfulness and reliability. His sales numbers were dropping as personal stress affected his ability to focus on work, creating a downward spiral that threatened the career advancement he'd been celebrating just weeks earlier. Dr. Rodriguez recommended increasing our therapy sessions to twice weekly as the harassment escalated. She had started documenting the family's behavior in case legal intervention became necessary, and she'd connected me with support groups for adults dealing with financial abuse from family members. What they're doing has a name, she explained during one session. Financial abuse often includes emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and threats when the victim tries to establish boundaries. Your family's response is textbook. Emma made her choice on a Wednesday evening, after a particularly brutal family confrontation, where Mom had demanded she call me and threatened to cut off contact if I didn't resume financial support immediately. "I can't do this anymore," she told me over the phone, her voice shaking with exhaustion and stress. "I'm going to finish school with student loans rather than be part of their plan to manipulate you." That decision cost her immediately. Dad drove to San Diego the next day and cleaned out her dorm room, taking everything he'd paid for, including her laptop, textbooks, and winter clothes. Mom canceled Emma's cell phone plan and car insurance, leaving her stranded on campus with no transportation or communication beyond the university's resources. The cruelest part was discovering that Mom had been secretly meeting with my former clients, spreading stories about my declining mental health and unreliable business practices. She'd presented herself as a concerned family member, trying to protect innocent businesses from working with someone who was clearly having psychological problems. 3 clients had already terminated their contracts based on Mom's interference. Others were asking questions about my stability and requesting reassurances that their projects would be completed professionally. My business reputation, built over years of careful relationship management, was being systematically destroyed by someone who claimed to love me. The private investigator I hired was a middle-aged woman named Diane Fletcher, who specialized in employment fraud and family harassment cases. Her preliminary findings exceeded even my worst expectations about how deeply the deception ran. Jake's employment fraud wasn't limited to his recent promotion application. He'd been listing me as a business reference for 3 years, using my client testimonials and professional credentials to support job applications at multiple dealerships. His entire career trajectory had been built on borrowed credibility, with my success providing the foundation for opportunities he couldn't have earned independently. Diane's research revealed that Jake had a gambling problem I'd never suspected. The $1,200 I'd been sending for his rent was supplemented by credit card advances and payday loans that he'd been using to cover losses at a casino 20 minutes from his apartment. Much of my financial support had been indirectly funding his addiction rather than helping him build stability. Dad's workers' compensation situation was even more complex. While his back injury was real, he'd been working under-the-table construction jobs for cash while claiming total disability. The physical therapy sessions I'd been helping fund were legitimate, but he was capable of much more physical activity than his insurance claims suggested. He's been doing weekend remodeling work for neighbors, Diane explained, showing me photos of Dad carrying lumber and operating power tools. Cash payments, no official records, while collecting disability benefits for an injury that's preventing him from doing exactly this type of work. The business attorney I consulted, recommended by Carlos, specialized in defamation cases involving professional reputation damage. She reviewed documentation of Mom's interference with my clients and determined that we had grounds for both cease and desist orders and potential civil damages. Your mother's actions constitute intentional interference with business relationships, attorney Patricia Williams explained. She's made false statements about your mental health to people with whom you have professional contracts, causing them to terminate those relationships based on fabricated concerns. My marketing business had actually grown substantially once I stopped spending mental energy managing family financial crises. 3 new clients had signed contracts in the past 2 weeks, attracted by referrals from existing customers who appreciated my renewed focus and energy. The income potential I'd been suppressing for years was finally becoming visible. Emma had moved in with me temporarily, sleeping on the air mattress, while I worked on getting her financial aid restructured. Her nursing program had emergency funds for students in crisis situations, and she qualified for additional grants based on her academic performance and family income changes. "I should have asked more questions years ago," she said one evening while we worked on her financial aid applications. "I knew you were helping with tuition, but I never thought about what you were giving up to make that possible." The restraining order application was straightforward, given the documented harassment pattern. Dad's visits to my apartment building, Mom's workplace interference, and Jake's attempts to sabotage my professional relationships provided clear evidence of ongoing stalking and intimidation tactics. Carlos connected me with his therapist friend who ran support groups for adults recovering from financial abuse. The first meeting was eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected, with stories from other people who'd spent years funding family members' lifestyles while their own dreams got smaller and smaller. The hardest part is accepting that they knew exactly what they were doing, said Maria, a woman whose parents had convinced her to fund their retirement while she lived paycheck to paycheck. They weren't confused or grateful. They felt entitled to my sacrifice. The job offer from Seattle came through networking I hadn't been able to do while managing family financial crises. Wilson Marketing Group had been following my work through industry publications and social media, where I'd finally started sharing professional achievements instead of hiding them to avoid family jealousy. The position was Senior Marketing Director, overseeing digital strategy for technology companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. The salary was double what I'd been earning freelance, with benefits that included relocation assistance and stock options in a rapidly growing firm. "We're particularly interested in your crisis management experience," the hiring manager said during our video interview. "Your ability to maintain client relationships under pressure suggests you'd handle our high-stress environment well." If only she knew what kind of pressure I'd been managing. Emma's decision to support my boundary setting had consequences that reached beyond financial aid complications. She'd lost her campus job when Dad convinced the coffee shop manager that hiring her would create liability issues, given our family's unstable situation. Her social life suffered when news of our family drama spread through her nursing program cohort, but she was also discovering strengths she'd never been forced to develop while family money provided security. The emergency financial aid application required her to advocate for herself in ways she'd never attempted, and she was successful, partly because she could articulate her situation clearly and professionally. "I'm actually proud of myself," she told me after securing partial aid for summer courses. "I never realized I could handle this kind of problem-solving when I had to do it myself." Jake's situation was deteriorating rapidly on multiple fronts. The HR investigation had resulted in his demotion back to entry-level sales, with a salary cut that left him unable to afford his apartment even without paying rent late. His credit was destroyed from missed payments during the transition period when my support ended abruptly. The employment fraud documentation was sufficient for his former employer to file charges if they chose to pursue them. Most companies preferred to handle these situations internally, but Jake's case involved enough deception that legal action remained possible. Mom's interference with my business relationships resulted in cease and desist orders that prohibited any further contact with my clients or professional associates. The legal documentation was clear about consequences if the harassment continued: substantial financial penalties and potential criminal charges for stalking. The family dynamics were shifting in unexpected ways without me serving as the financial scapegoat. Dad and Jake were arguing constantly about whose fault the crisis was, with each blaming the other for the lifestyle choices that had created their dependence on my income. "Jake keeps saying Dad should get a real job," Emma reported after talking to Aunt Sarah. "Dad keeps saying Jake should have saved money instead of spending everything on his apartment and gambling. They're both right, but neither wants to admit their own responsibility." My therapist sessions were focused on planning my transition to Seattle and maintaining the boundaries that had taken so much emotional energy to establish. Dr. Rodriguez was particularly interested in my growing sense of personal agency after years of feeling responsible for everyone else's problems. "You're discovering what your life looks like when you're not managing other people's crises," she observed. That's probably scary and liberating at the same time. The realization that struck me most powerfully was how much mental space opened up when I stopped worrying about everyone else's financial problems. I was sleeping better, thinking more clearly, and making professional decisions based on my own goals rather than calculating how they might affect my ability to support dependent family members. For the first time in 3 years, I was planning a future that belonged entirely to me. The legal consequences unfolded exactly as Attorney Williams had predicted. Jake's employment fraud resulted in his immediate termination once the dealership's investigation concluded, with his personnel file documenting the false information that would follow him to future job applications. The industry was small enough that word spread quickly about his deceptive practices. The restraining order was granted after a brief court hearing where Judge Martinez reviewed the documented harassment evidence. Dad's visits to my apartment building, Mom's interference with my business relationships, and Jake's attempts to steal clients constituted a clear pattern of stalking behavior that warranted legal intervention. Mr. Stewart. The judge addressed my father during the proceedings. Your son has every right to discontinue financial support without facing harassment or intimidation. If you contact his workplace, or his clients again, you'll face criminal charges for violating this order. Mom's workers' compensation fraud was reported to the State Insurance Commission after Diane's investigation documented his under-the-table construction work. The benefits he'd been receiving while claiming total disability were suspended pending a comprehensive review that would likely result in criminal charges. My professional reputation recovered more quickly than I'd expected once clients learned the truth about Mom's interference. Several relationships that had been damaged by her false statements were restored after I provided documentation of the restraining order and the circumstances that had prompted her behavior. We should have called you directly when your mother contacted us, admitted David Chen, the restaurant owner who'd terminated his contract based on Mom's claims about my mental health. We've worked together for 2 years. We know you're reliable. The Seattle job offer provided the perfect opportunity for a complete, fresh start. Wilson Marketing Group covered all relocation expenses, including the deposit on a 1-bedroom apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, and moving costs for the modest possessions I'd accumulated in my studio space. Emma's financial aid appeal was successful beyond our most optimistic expectations. The emergency grant covered not only her summer tuition, but also provided enough support for her to quit her campus job and focus entirely on her nursing studies during her final year. The financial aid counselor said my situation qualified for several programs I didn't know existed. She told me over the phone after meeting with the university's emergency assistance team. Students whose families cut them off for refusing to participate in abusive situations get priority consideration. The family's forced accountability was painful but necessary. Dad and Mom lost their house to foreclosure within 2 months, moving into a rental duplex in a neighborhood that reflected their actual income rather than the lifestyle my subsidies had maintained. The downsizing was dramatic, from a 4-bedroom house with a 2-car garage to a cramped space where they had to share utilities with strangers. Jake moved back in with our parents after his eviction, sleeping in what had once been Dad's home office. His relationship with Brittany was permanently damaged, not just by the financial deceptions, but by her discovery of his gambling addiction and the extent to which he'd built his identity around borrowed success. Mom took a second job at a grocery store working early morning shifts that started at 5 a.m. and left her exhausted for her afternoon retail position. For the first time in 3 years, she was experiencing the physical and emotional stress that most working families navigated without expecting their children to rescue them. The most satisfying change was watching them discover capabilities they'd never been forced to develop while my money solved their problems. Dad's back injury improved dramatically once he started physical therapy that he was paying for himself with exercises he took seriously because he needed the job mobility that recovery would provide. Emma and I maintained regular contact as she finished her nursing degree, with our relationship evolving into something healthier than it had ever been when financial dependence complicated our interactions. She visited Seattle during spring break, staying in my guest room, and marveling at the life I'd built once my income belonged entirely to me. "Your apartment is amazing," she said, standing on the balcony looking out over Puget Sound toward the Olympic Mountains. "I can't believe you were living in that tiny studio while paying for everyone else's lives." My dating life resumed for the first time since the family financial crisis had consumed all my emotional energy. Jennifer was a project manager at a software company, someone I'd met through the networking events I could finally attend once my evenings weren't devoted to managing family emergencies. "You're different from most guys I've dated," she said, after we'd been seeing each other for several weeks. "You actually seem present during conversations, like you're not worried about a dozen other things." The therapy sessions with Dr. Rodriguez evolved into maintenance appointments, focused on sustaining the boundaries I'd established rather than crisis management. She was particularly interested in how my self-perception had changed once I stopped defining my worth through my usefulness to other people. "You've discovered that your value doesn't depend on solving everyone else's problems," she observed during one session. "That's a fundamental shift in how you relate to the world." The marketing firm in Seattle provided opportunities for professional growth that had been impossible, while my personal life was dominated by financial crisis management. I was promoted to Vice President of Client Relations within 6 months, with responsibilities that included developing new service offerings and managing our highest value accounts. My relationship with Emma stabilized into something genuine and mutual, rather than one-sided financial rescue. She sent graduation photos from her nursing program, and I sent pictures of the hiking trails around Mount Rainier. We talked about her job search and my work projects without either conversation being dominated by family drama. The extended family gradually sorted itself into camps based on their own experiences with financial boundaries and family obligations. Uncle Pete and Aunt Sarah maintained distance from the immediate family drama while offering quiet support for my decisions. Cousins who'd dealt with similar situations understood my choice, while others remained convinced that family loyalty required financial sacrifice regardless of appreciation. Jake's recovery was slow but genuine. The gambling addiction treatment program he entered after losing his job was partially funded by the county's mental health services, and he was making progress in understanding how his entitlement mentality had developed over years of expecting rescue without consequences. He's starting to understand that he can't build a life on other people's money. Emma reported after visiting during winter break. "It's painful to watch, but he's actually developing real job skills for the first time." Mom and Dad's relationship with each other improved slightly once they stopped having someone to blame for their financial problems. They were forced to work together on budget management and practical problem-solving in ways they'd avoided, while my money provided a cushion against poor decision-making. The life lesson that emerged from 3 years of financial manipulation was clearer than I'd expected. Love and respect were not the same thing, and covering someone's bills didn't guarantee either. The family members who genuinely cared about my well-being had supported my boundary setting, while those who valued me primarily as a financial resource had disappeared once the money stopped. Standing on my apartment balcony in Seattle, drinking coffee while watching the sunrise over Mount Rainier, I understood that walking away from people who didn't value me had led directly to a life where I valued myself. The freedom to make decisions based on my own goals rather than everyone else's needs had unlocked potential I'd been suppressing for years. Emma called while I was enjoying the morning view, sharing news about her job offer at Seattle Children's Hospital. She'd be moving to the city in 3 months, creating an opportunity for us to build a sibling relationship based on mutual support rather than financial dependency. "I've been thinking about what happened with our family," she said, "and I realize that you gave them the greatest gift possible by stopping the money. You forced all of us to grow up." The final call to action seemed natural after sharing this journey with you. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where helping family or friends turned into a cycle of dependency that left you feeling unappreciated? How did you handle it? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to help others find it who might be dealing with similar family dynamics. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about standing up for yourself and setting healthy boundaries in difficult relationships. And if you know someone who's struggling with financial manipulation from family members, please share this video. Sometimes, hearing someone else's experience can provide the courage needed to make difficult but necessary changes. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community where we can discuss these challenging family situations honestly. Remember that your worth isn't measured by your willingness to solve other people's problems. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's dependence. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.